Imagine you've just invented, like a revolutionary piece of technology.
Okay.
Let's say it's 1920, right? And you've developed this high-speed electric monorail.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You have the blueprints, you've done the math, and you are absolutely convinced this thing can hit 160 miles per hour.
Which for 1920 is that's unbelievable.
Exactly. It could completely modernize American transportation.
Okay.
So you take it to the federal government.
Makes sense.
You show up at the agency in charge of the nation's transit, expecting them to maybe, I don't know, offer you a grant, or
Yes.
at the very least give you a hearing.
Right. Hear you out.
Right. Instead, after weeks of you pitching your idea, the officials in charge get so annoyed by your persistence that they literally have you legally committed to an insane asylum.
It honestly sounds like a dystopian novel. I mean, the idea that a government bureaucracy could just lock up an innovator just because his ideas were disruptive to their daily routine, it's terrifying.
It really is.
But that actually happened. In March of 1920, this inventor, named Ibn Moody Boynton, was thrown into a psychiatric institution in Washington, D.C. as a, quote, lunatic.
Just wild.
All because he kept bothering the Interstate Commerce Commission with his monorail pitch.
And that bizarre, deeply unsettling piece of history is kind of our gateway into today's deep dive.
Yeah, we are looking at a massive stack of historical research today.
We really are. We're detailing the life, the explosive growth, and the eventual and highly protracted death of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC.
Right, tracing its whole arc from its creation back in 1887 all the way to its final abolition in 1995.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really understand the hidden machinery of the modern regulatory state, and to do it without getting completely bogged down in all the legal jargon.
Which is easy to do with this stuff. But to really grasp the magnitude of the ICC, you kind of have to look at it as a structural blueprint.
Oh, so?
Well, when it was created, the ICC wasn't just, another government office added to some org chart. It was the very first independent regulatory agency in the United States.
The very first one.
Exactly. It essentially birthed this idea of a fourth branch of government. I mean, before 1887, the structure of the republic was strictly divided. You had the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches.
Right, the classic three.
Yeah. And the ICC introduced this completely new concept, a multi-headed commission designed to sit outside direct political control. Operating with this mix of rulemaking, enforcement, and adjudicative powers, all rolled into one entity.
So every single time you see a federal agency regulating a part of your life today, you're essentially looking at the direct descendants of the ICC.
Oh, absolutely.
Like when the FCC manages broadband access, or the SEC monitors the stock market, or the FTC goes after corporate monopolies.
They are all utilizing the exact administrative architecture that was invented for the ICC. They're the children of this late 19th century experiment.
We are going to explore how this single agency, which, by the way, was created just to keep train ticket prices fair for farmers, accidentally became a trailblazer for the civil rights movement.
Yeah, that pivot is incredible.
It tried to micromanage the entire American economy and eventually became so toxic that it literally legislated itself into total irrelevance.
The trajectory is just staggering. But to understand the end, or, even the middle, we have to look at the massive economic forces that forced the U.S. government to invent this new type of regulatory body in the first place.
We have to go back to the Gilded Age.
We do.
So let's set the stage. It's the 1880s. Grover Cleveland is president. The country is expanding rapidly westward. I want to know the why here. What was the specific spark that made Congress decide they needed a fourth branch of government?
The spark was actually a furious, widespread agrarian revolt.
Farmers.
Exactly. We're talking about intense anti-railroad agitation, predominantly driven by Western farmers, and this really influential rural organization known as the Grange Movement.
Right, the Grangers.
Yeah. You have to put yourself in the economic reality of an American farmer in the 1880s.
Yeah.
I mean, there are no interstate highways.
Yeah.
There are no commercial trucking fleets. Airplanes obviously haven't been invented yet. The railroad is the sole artery of commerce.
So if you're a farmer growing wheat in Nebraska and you need to sell that wheat in Chicago, you don't have options.
None.
You can't just go rent a fleet of U-Hauls if the local train depot charges too much.
That lack of options was the absolute crux of the crisis. The railroads possessed a level of economic power that was virtually unprecedented in human history.
Wow.
They were the tech giants of their day. They operated these massive, capital-intensive networks that completely dictated the economic life or death of entire regions.
And the farmers were just at their mercy.
Completely. And they had three massive systemic grievances against the railroads. First, absolute monopolistic power. Second, rampant rate discrimination. And third, deep-seated political corruption.
Let's break down that rate discrimination piece first, because I think people assume monopoly just means, high prices.
Right.
But looking at the source material, the pricing wasn't just high. It was chaotic. It was arbitrary. And it was specifically designed to punish the little guy.
Arbitrary is the perfect word for it. The railroads engaged in this rampant price discrimination between similarly situated customers.
How did that work?
Well, they would look at two different farmers shipping the exact same volume of grain to the exact same destination, and they would charge them wildly different prices.
Just based on who they were?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
A massive corporate shipper, like a large mining operation or a sprawling industrial farm, they would secretly negotiate a massive rebate. So the railroad would charge them a fraction of the published rate.
Okay, so the big guys get a huge discount.
Yeah. And to make up for that lost revenue, the railroad would then gouge the small, independent farmers who had zero negotiating leverage.
So the small farmer is literally subsidizing the profit margins of the massive corporation.
Exactly.
It's like if an internet service provider charged a local mom-and-pop bakery $1,000 a month for basic dial-up speeds.
Yeah, that's a great comparison.
But then they gave a multinational tech conglomerate a secret deal for top-tier gigabit fiber for, like, $10 a month. The mom-and-pop bakery can't compete, not because their product is worse, but because the infrastructure costs are totally rigged.
That analogy hits the underlying mechanism perfectly. The railroads were picking winners and losers in the American economy. But it gets even more complex when you look at geographical discrimination.
Right, the long-haul versus short-haul problem. I saw that phrase repeated throughout the research. How did that actually work in practice? Why would a shorter trip ever cost more than a longer one?
It comes down to the nature of railroad competition at the time. Let's say you want to ship a load of manufactured goods from New York to Chicago.
Okay.
That's a long haul.
Yeah.
But because those are two massive metropolitan hubs, there are 3 or 4 different railroad companies that have tracks connecting them.
So they have to fight for your business?
Exactly. To win your business, those 4 railroads have to compete, so they slash their prices. The rate from New York to Chicago just plummets.
Okay, that makes sense. Competition drives down prices. That's capitalism.
Right. But railroads have massive fixed costs.
Yeah.
They're maintaining thousands of miles of track, paying huge crews, buying tons of coal. If they're losing money on that highly competitive New York to Chicago route, they have to make it up somewhere else.
Ah, so they look for a captive audience.
Precisely. They look at the rural routes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say a farmer in a tiny town in Iowa wants to ship grain to Chicago. That town only have one railroad track running through it. The railroad has an absolute localized monopoly there.
So they just jack up the price astronomically.
Exactly. It was a completely common occurrence for a farmer shipping grain 200 miles to pay significantly more than an industrialist shipping steel 800 miles.
That is infuriating. I mean, you can entirely see why the Grange movement was mobilizing. They are just being bled dry.
Completely.
But if this was so obviously unfair, why didn't the state governments or the local mayors step in and stop it?
Because the railroads had already bought them. And they did it using one of the most brilliant, insidious, and perfectly legal soft lobbying tactics ever invented.
The free annual pass.
The free annual pass.
This detail fascinated me because we aren't talking about handing over briefcases full of cash in dark alleys here. This was out in the open.
It was entirely institutionalized. The railroads would issue free, unlimited yearly transportation passes to anyone they deemed an, quote, opinion leader.
So who are we talking about?
We are talking about state legislators, judges, city councilmen, newspaper editors, and even local ministers.
Come ministers. That is so calculated.
Isn't it?
They are ensuring that the moral authority in the town can't preach a sermon against the railroad without looking like a massive hypocrite.
Precisely. I mean, if the editor of the local newspaper is using his free pass to take his family on vacation to the coast every summer, he is significantly less likely to run a scathing front-page editorial about how the railroad's freight rates are driving local farmers into bankruptcy.
Right. It functioned as a systemic muzzle on any local opposition.
It really did.
So the system is completely rigged. The states are powerless because their politicians are corrupted by these free passes. And even if a state did manage to pass a law, the railroad just crosses a state line where the law no longer applies.
Exactly. The jurisdiction issue was huge.
So the farmers finally take this to Washington, D.C., and in 1887, Congress passes the Interstate Commerce Act.
Yes, signed by President Grover Cleveland. The act creates the ICC. It mandates that all shipping rates must be just and reasonable. It explicitly bans the secret rebates and that long-haul, short-haul discrimination.
Right.
And it establishes a 5-member commission to oversee it all.
And they put a really serious legal mind in charge, too, Thomas M. Cooley.
Thomas M. Cooley was the perfect choice to give this brand-new fourth branch some immediate credibility. He was a titan of legal scholarship. He was the former dean of the University of Michigan Law School and the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court.
Serious credential.
Very. The explicit design was to have a panel of independent experts, nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, who would sit above the partisan fray of regular politics.
But I have to stop and point out the sheer audacity of this.
Yeah.
You have 5 guys sitting at wooden desks in Washington, D.C., and their job is to rein in the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Morgans, the absolute wealthiest, most ruthless corporate titans of the Gilded Age.
It was a tall order.
How could this tiny, untested agency possibly enforce these massive new rules across a continental economy?
Well, the harsh historical reality is that they couldn't.
They couldn't.
No. The ICC's first decade was an absolute disaster of enforcement. They were a textbook example of a toothless tiger.
So Congress wrote a rule book, but they basically forgot to give the referees a whistle.
Oh, they gave them a whistle.
Yeah.
They just didn't give them the authority to throw anyone out of the game. The foundational flaw in the 1887 Interstate Commerce Act was a severe lack of enforcement mechanisms. It was a massive gap between the grand legislative intent of Congress and the grinding legal reality of the American judicial system.
Walk us through what happened when the ICC actually tried to enforce that just and reasonable clause. Let's say a group of farmers complains that a railroad is charging them triple the rate of the next town over.
Okay.
The ICC investigates and agrees. What happens next?
So following the passage of the act, the ICC would hold a hearing, review the data, and then issue an order telling the railroad to lower its maximum rate to a specific dollar amount.
Okay.
The railroad's response, almost universally, was to simply ignore the order.
Wait, they just threw the federal order in the trash?
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Because under the original law, if a railroad ignored an ICC order, the ICC didn't have the power to fine them directly or shut down their operations.
So what could they do?
The ICC had to go to a federal court and file a lawsuit to force the railroad to comply.
So the railroad just moves the fight to a venue where they have the ultimate advantage.
Exactly. Infinite legal budgets.
Yeah.
And they deployed those legal budgets mercilessly. The railroads dragged these cases out for years through endless appeals.
Right. Just stall them out.
Yeah. And when the cases finally reached the Supreme Court in the late 1890s, the courts dealt the ICC a series of devastating blows.
What did they rule?
The Supreme Court ruled that while the ICC had the power to declare an existing rate unjust or unreasonable, the 1887 law did not explicitly give the ICC the power to set a new maximum rate for the future.
Wait. Let me make sure I understand the absurdity of that legal logic. The government agency could point at a $10 train ticket and say, that is illegal and unfair.
Yes.
But they couldn't say, the ticket must be $5.
Exactly. They could diagnose the disease, but the courts ruled they had no legal authority to prescribe the cure.
That is wild.
So a railroad could have their $10 rate struck down, and the very next day, they could issue a new rate of $9.99.
And the ICC would have to start the entire multi-year court process all over again.
Precisely. It was a nightmare.
That is maddening. It basically renders the entire agency performative. If they can't actually fix the prices, what were these 5 commissioners doing all day?
Well, they pivoted. They moved to areas where they did have some undisputed authority. They actually became the primary federal investigation agency for railroad accidents.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They started compiling massive databases of crash statistics, looking into boiler explosions and derailments, which objectively was vital public safety work.
Sure.
But it wasn't the aggressive economic regulation that the Grange movement had demanded.
Right. They were supposed to be the financial watchdogs, and they ended up being the crash scene investigators.
Pretty much.
There is a specific document in the source material from this era that I think is one of the most cynical, revealing things I've ever read. It perfectly captures how the corporate elite viewed this neutered agency.
You are definitely referring to the Richard Olney letter.
Yes. Listener, you need to hear the actual text of this because it is an absolute masterclass in corporate strategy.
It really is.
The year is 1892. Richard Oney is a highly connected private attorney who frequently represents railroad interests. He is writing a confidential letter to Charles Eliot Perkins, who is the president of the massive Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad.
A very powerful man.
Very. And Perkins is furious that the ICC exists and wants to lobby Congress to abolish it. Oney writes back and essentially tells him to calm down because the ICC is the best thing that ever happened to them.
And Olney's exact phrasing is chillingly precise.
Here's what Oney wrote, quote, "The commission is, or can be made, of great use to the railroads. It satisfies the popular clamor for a government supervision of the railroads, while at the same time that supervision is almost entirely nominal."
Nominal supervision. It is a devastating indictment.
It really...
What Olney is explaining to the railroad president is the concept of regulatory theater. He is saying, look, if we abolish the ICC, the farmers will riot, and Congress might pass a law with actual teeth. But if we keep the ICC around, the public thinks they are being protected.
Right. They see the official seal and feel safe.
Exactly. Yeah. They see a federal building with an eagle on the seal, and they assume someone is watching out for them. Meanwhile, the agency has no actual power, and we can continue operating our monopolies exactly as we always have.
It's the ultimate shield. The watchdog isn't just toothless. The burglar is literally feeding the watchdog steaks so the homeowners stay asleep.
That's a great way to put it.
And this raises a massive question about the psychological impact of government. I mean, when a regulatory body is created with immense fanfare, promising to level the playing field, but actually functions as a buffer to protect corporate monopolies from public anger, it breeds a deep systemic cynicism.
And that cynicism eventually boiled over. Congress eventually realized the charade just couldn't continue. The agrarian populist movement was gaining massive political traction. The courts had completely humiliated the ICC, and the federal government decided they needed to stop playing games.
So what did they do?
They decided to hand the ICC a legislative sledgehammer.
Which kicks off the second major era in our deep dive. From roughly 1906 to 1935, the ICC transforms from this mocked, toothless tiger into an absolute bureaucratic behemoth.
Oh, yeah.
They start absorbing jurisdiction over the American economy at a terrifying pace.
The expansion is breathtaking. It starts with a tightening of safety regulations. The 1893 Railroad Safety Appliance Act, which was further strengthened in 1903 and 1910, gave the ICC supreme jurisdiction over railroad safety technologies, completely preempting state laws.
Right.
They mandated automatic couplers and air brakes, which genuinely saved thousands of lives. But the real shift in economic power came with the Hepburn Act of 1906.
How did the Hepburn Act solve the problem of the Supreme Court constantly striking down the ICC's orders?
Congress simply rewrote the law to be airtight. The Hepburn Act explicitly, unquestionably authorized the ICC to set maximum railroad rates. The legal ambiguity was gone.
So no more loopholes?
None. If the ICC said the rate from Chicago to Omaha was $5, it was $5, and the burden of proof shifted to the railroads to prove why it shouldn't be.
So they finally get the power to fix the prices, but they didn't stop at trains, did they?
Not even close. The Hepburn Act expanded the ICC's regulatory umbrella to cover bridges, terminals, ferries, sleeping car companies, express shipping companies, and even oil pipelines.
Wait, oil pipelines. I have to jump in here. How does an agency created specifically because farmers were mad at grain shipping rates suddenly get jurisdiction over the booming petroleum industry?
It seems like a stretch, right?
It feels like a massive leap in scope.
It was a leap, but a calculated one. Congress realized that oil pipelines functioned exactly like railroads. They were massive, capital-intensive infrastructure projects that effectively created regional monopolies.
Standard Oil.
Exactly.
Yep.
John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil was using its control of pipelines to crush competing refineries. Congress saw the ICC as their new all-purpose hammer for any infrastructure monopoly, so they threw pipelines into the mix.
And then, 4 years later, they tossed telecommunications onto the pile.
Yes. The Mann-Elkins Act in 1910. This act finally put the nail in the coffin of the long-haul versus short-haul fare discrimination we talked about earlier.
Oh, good.
But crucially, it expanded the ICC's jurisdiction to include the regulation of telephone, telegraph, and wireless companies.
Oh, wait.
For a period of time, the ICC was regulating the physical movement of goods and the electronic movement of information across the continent.
Okay, giving an agency this much power is one thing, but how a bureaucracy chooses to exercise that power is where things usually go off the rails.
Definitely.
And we have to talk about the Valuation Act of 1913. When I read this section of the research, I actually had to read it twice because the sheer scale of the bureaucratic hubris is just mind-boggling.
The Valuation Act is widely considered one of the most extreme examples of administrative bloat in early 20th century history.
It's nuts.
The logic behind it, from a purely academic standpoint, almost makes sense. The ICC was tasked with setting rates that allowed the railroads to earn a fair return on their investments.
Right, because the Constitution says you can't just seize private property, so the government has to let the railroads make some profit.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the ICC bureaucrats asked themselves, how do we calculate a fair percentage of profit if we don't know the actual mathematical value of the company?
Oh, no.
The railroads claimed their networks were worth billions. The populace claimed the railroads were inflating those numbers to justify high ticket prices.
So the ICC decides they need to find the objective, true value of every railroad in America.
Yes. In 1913, Congress passed the Valuation Act, ordering the ICC to organize a massive new bureau valuation. Their mission was to physically assess the value of every single piece of railroad property in the United States.
Let's ground this in reality for a second. Consider the physical scale of the United States in 1913.
Huge.
The railroad network stretched from the harbors of New York to the deserts of Arizona to the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest. And the government decided they were going to count every single railroad tie.
Every single one.
Every spike, every mile of steel track, every wooden depot, every water tower, every steam locomotive, every switching yard. They tried to physically inventory a continental empire to figure out what a train ticket should cost.
To pull this off, the ICC had to hire an absolute army of civil engineers, accountants, and field inspectors. They sent teams out into the wilderness with clipboards, surveying equipment, and adding machines.
I just picture guys in suits hiking into the mountains.
Pretty much. They were measuring the depth of the gravel ballast under the tracks in the middle of Montana.
It's like if the government today decided that before they could regulate internet prices, they needed to deploy federal agents to individually appraise every single server in every Amazon data center.
Yeah, trace every mile of deep-sea fiber optic cable.
Right. And calculate the exact depreciation curve and millions of cooling fans. It is an impossible task. How long did this actually take?
The valuation process continued for almost 20 years.
20 years. That means by the time you finish counting the rail cars in California, the ones you counted in New York have rusted away and been replaced 3 times over. The data is structurally obsolete the moment you write it down.
Exactly. The economy is dynamic. A bureaucracy moves at a crawl. By the time the ICC finally began publishing these massive, multi-volume valuation reports in the 1930s, the entire transportation landscape had changed.
I mean, we had cars by then.
The automobile had been invented, the Great Depression had hit, and the meticulously calculated true value of a 1913 steam engine was completely irrelevant. Historians and economists universally agree that this 2-decade, massively expensive valuation project was of practically zero use in actually setting fair rates.
It was a monument to administrative waste. But the expansion era wasn't just wasteful. It actually had severe immediate consequences for the broader economy.
It did.
Let's talk about the Panic of 1907. Because the research suggests the ICC's new rate-setting powers directly contributed to a massive financial crisis. How does capping a train ticket price crash Wall Street?
It comes down to the mechanics of corporate finance and unintended consequences. When the Hepburn Act passed in 1906, the ICC immediately began aggressively enforcing strict limitations on railroad rates. They capped the revenue the railroads could bring in.
Okay.
But at the same time, the cost of labor and materials, steel, coal, wages, was rising.
So the railroad's expenses are going up, but the government legally forbids them from raising their prices to cover those expenses. Their profit margins get squeezed.
They don't just get squeezed, they collapse. Now, in the early 20th century, railroad securities, the corporate bonds issued by the railroads to fund their expansion, were the bedrock of the American financial system.
Wow.
Major trust companies and banks held massive portfolios of railroad bonds as their primary secure assets.
Because everyone assumed the railroads would always make money. They were the blue chip stocks of the era.
Exactly. But when investors realized the ICC's new price controls meant the railroads could no longer generate enough profit to guarantee those bond payments, the value of railroad securities plummeted. The bonds depreciated drastically.
And when the bonds lose their value, the balance sheets of the major banks holding those bonds suddenly look toxic.
Precisely. The banks no longer had the capital reserves they thought they had. This massive depreciation in railroad securities was a major, direct contributing factor in triggering the Panic of 1907.
That's incredible.
A liquidity crisis swept through Wall Street, banks failed, and the broader economy suffered a severe contraction. The agency created to protect the American economy from instability inadvertently engineered a financial panic by failing to understand the complex, interconnected nature of capital markets.
It is the ultimate cautionary tale of heavy-handed price controls. And yet, the ICC's response to this wasn't to back off, was it? By 1935, they look at the emerging trucking and bus industries, and they demand control over those too.
Yes. The Motor Carrier Act of 1935 brings interstate trucking and bus lines under the ICC's jurisdiction. The logic was that if the ICC only controlled trains, they couldn't actually control the transportation market because shippers would just switch to trucks.
Right.
So the bureaucracy had to absorb the competing technology to maintain its grip.
As the ICC gathered all this unprecedented power over decades, their internal culture really shifted. They started attempting these massive utopian social and economic engineering projects.
Yeah, they really did.
And this brings us back to the wild anecdotes we touched on at the start of the deep dive. The Ripley Plan and the inventor in the asylum.
These stories perfectly illustrate the mindset of a bureaucracy that has convinced itself that it possesses the omniscience to manage a continental economy from a desk in Washington.
Right. Let's examine the Ripley Plan first.
Okay, so after World War I, in the Transportation Act of 1920, Congress directed the ICC to prepare a master plan to consolidate all the hundreds of independent railway properties in the United States into a limited number of massive systems.
They want to forcibly merge the industry. Why?
Because the ICC was tired of having to set different rates for strong, profitable railroads and weak, failing railroads. They thought, hey, if we just force all the strong companies to absorb the weak companies, we'll have a uniform system that is much easier for us to regulate.
So they hire an academic to draw the map.
Yes. They hired William Z. Ripley, a prominent professor of political economy at Harvard University.
Naturally.
Between 1920 and 1923, Professor Ripley sat in an office and drafted a master plan for the American economy. In 1929, the ICC published it as the Complete Plan of Consolidation.
What did this professor's map actually look like? How do you carve up the United States?
He proposed consolidating the entire sprawling industry into just 21 regional railroads, plus about 100 specific terminal operations. He was playing corporate matchmaker on a staggering scale. He was literally drawing lines on a map, declaring that the Boston and Maine Railroad must merge with the Delaware and Hudson. He mandated that the mighty Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had to absorb the Reading Railroad and half of the Moonen Railroad.
Just dictating it.
Yeah, he told the Union Pacific they were now paired with the Kansas City Southern.
It is staggering hubris. You have a Harvard professor and a panel of bureaucrats looking at a map and casually deciding the fate of billions of dollars of private enterprise.
Right.
They're ignoring corporate cultures, existing debt structures, deeply ingrained rivalries, just completely overriding market. You two companies will marry, you will share this track because it makes our regulatory models run smoother.
And the reality of the free market completely rejected this academic exercise. Almost immediately after the plan was published in 1929, the Great Depression hit.
Oh, perfect timing.
Yeah, many smaller, weaker railroads went bankrupt. Of the major lines that survived, the strong ones absolutely refused to be shackled to the failing ones just because a government pamphlet said they had to.
Because in reality, a strong company's board of directors isn't going to deliberately bankrupt their own shareholders to save an inefficient competitor just to make the ICC's map look aesthetically pleasing.
Exactly. The railroads resisted furiously, the economic realities on the ground shifted daily, and the ICC's grand vision completely crumbled. Finally, Congress had to admit defeat. They formally repudiated the Ripley Plan with the Transportation Act of 1940, and the entire top-down consolidation idea was scrapped.
So they failed spectacularly at corporate matchmaking. But the story of Ibn Moody Boynton, the monorail inventor, is where the ICC's behavior crosses the line from bureaucratic overreach into something genuinely dark. Let's delve back into that.
Boynton's story is a profound warning about the psychological rigidity of entrenched bureaucracies. So in 1920, Ibn Moody Boynton had developed the Boynton Bicycle Railroad. As we mentioned, it was an innovative electric light rail system running on a single track.
And he had working prototypes, right?
He did. Proponents of the technology claimed it could achieve speeds of up to 160 miles an hour, which would have completely superseded traditional heavy steam train travel.
It is the 1920 equivalent of pitching a hyperloop. Boynton knows the ICC controls all transportation in America, so he goes to them to get his technology adopted.
Yes. And he was persistent. According to the sworn testimony of the ICC's own chief clerk, Boynton became virtually a daily visitor at the ICC headquarters in Washington. He was constantly seeking meetings, constantly pushing the commission to evaluate and adopt his proposal.
And how does this multi-headed independent agency, which was ostensibly created to foster and protect American commerce, respond to a persistent innovator?
They didn't assign an engineer to review his math. They didn't tell him to go build a test track.
No.
In March of 1920, officials of the ICC coordinated with local authorities and literally had even Moody Boynton committed to a psychiatric institution in Washington, D.C.
The government agency in charge of transportation locked an inventor in an asylum. On what medical grounds?
That is the most disturbing part. ICC officials later stated on the record that they had him committed because he was, quote, worrying them to death with his constant promotion of the bicycle railroad.
Worrying them to death. That is the actual historical quote.
It is.
They didn't claim he was violent. They didn't claim he was a danger to himself. He was simply a nuisance to their administrative routine.
He challenged their paradigm. Bureaucracies, by their very nature, crave stability, predictability, and order. They exist to manage the status quo.
Right.
When someone walks in off the street with an idea that threatens to render the entire existing infrastructure obsolete, the bureaucracy doesn't view that as an opportunity. They view it as an attack. They pathologized his innovation.
It perfectly illustrates how ordinary citizens often feel when dealing with impenetrable government systems today. You bring a new way of doing things, and the machine tries to grind you down. Did Boynton ever get out?
He did, thankfully. He fought back from inside the institution. Based on his own highly coherent testimony, and with the crucial high-level intervention of a Massachusetts congressman named William S. Greene, Boynton won his release on May 28, 1920.
Wow.
He spent roughly 2 months locked in an asylum simply for pitching a train to the train commission.
While the ICC was busy drawing fantasy maps and swatting away eccentric inventors, the timeline of American history was moving forward. And the agency found itself inadvertently thrust into the center of the greatest moral and social struggle of the 20th century. The ICC, almost entirely by accident, became a pioneer in the civil rights movement.
It is a remarkable historical pivot, and it highlights the unforeseen consequences of centralized power. It is vital to state clearly upfront racial integration, social justice, and civil rights were never the primary focus of the ICC's legislative mandate. The commissioners were economists, lawyers, and logistics managers. But because the Constitution grants the federal government power over commerce that crosses state lines, and because passenger travel is explicitly defined as commerce, the ICC was legally forced to confront Jim Crow.
This is where we see the legal mechanics of the Constitution doing some really unexpected, profound heavy lifting. Civil rights leaders looked at the board, saw the Southern courts were heavily biased, and brilliantly realized they could use the federal economic regulatory framework of the ICC to dismantle segregation.
They turned a logistics agency into a civil rights battleground.
It's genius.
Let's trace the timeline, because it builds a steady drumbeat of legal victories that precede and parallel the broader, more famous events of the civil rights movement. The strategy really gains traction in April 1941 with a case called Mitchell v. United States.
Okay, what happened there?
A black congressman from Illinois, Arthur Mitchell, paid for a first-class train ticket. When the train crossed into Arkansas, he was compelled by the conductor to leave the first-class car and ride in a segregated, dilapidated second-class car.
So Mitchell complains to the ICC, right? And what does the ICC say?
The ICC initially dismissed his complaint. They were very reluctant to interfere with Southern social customs. But Mitchell took it to the Supreme Court.
Good for him.
And the Supreme Court ruled that compelling a passenger who paid for a first-class ticket to ride in second-class conditions was fundamentally unjust and a direct violation of the Interstate Commerce Act's ban on discrimination. They forced the ICC to reverse its order.
So the Supreme Court forces the ICC to recognize that if you pay the first-class rate, you get the first-class seat, regardless of race, purely because to do otherwise is bad business practice under the regulatory framework. It's an economic argument achieving a moral victory.
Exactly. Then the strategy moves to buses. In June 1946, you have Morgan v. Virginia, where the Supreme Court strikes down state laws requiring segregation on interstate buses.
Using the same logic.
Again, the reasoning was primarily economic. Forcing a bus driver to stop and rearrange all the passengers by race every time the vehicle crossed a state line was deemed an unconstitutional burden on interstate commerce.
Wow. And then they tackle the dining cars.
Yes, in June 1950, Henderson v. United States. A black passenger with a first-class ticket was denied service in the dining car because the single table, conditionally reserved for black passengers, was occupied by white passengers, and the curtain was drawn.
I want to highlight the ICC's initial reaction to the Henderson case because it shows how deeply resistant the bureaucracy was to taking a stand.
Right. The ICC's initial ruling was to try and pass the buck. They ruled that the railroad's racist policy was merely an error in judgment on the part of an individual dining car steward.
Unbelievable.
They tried to treat systemic racism as a localized customer service failure. But the Supreme Court struck that down too, finding that the published systemic policies of the Southern Railway itself violated the Interstate Commerce Act.
The ICC keeps trying to dodge the issue, and the Supreme Court keeps forcing them back into the ring. But the truly landmark moment, the case where the ICC itself finally changes its internal legal paradigm, happens in the 1950s. It involves a woman named Sarah Keyes. Listener, this is a story that should be taught in every history class.
The Sarah Keyes case is a masterclass in legal perseverance. The date is August 1st, 1952. Private Sarah Keyes, a member of the Women's Army Corps, is traveling in full military uniform on a bus from New Jersey to North Carolina.
Okay.
During a stop, the driver ordered her to give up her seat in the front of the bus to a white Marine and move to the back. She refused. She was arrested, held overnight, and fined.
A woman serving her country in uniform is arrested for sitting in a seat she paid for. So she files a formal complaint with the ICC, challenging the fundamental separate but equal doctrine in bus segregation. And she is represented by an absolutely brilliant civil rights lawyer named Dovey Johnson Roundtree.
Roundtree's strategy was audacious. They filed the complaint against the Carolina Coach Company. Now remember the timeline. This is unfolding right around the time the Supreme Court is deciding Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which famously struck down separate but equal in public schools.
How does the ICC react to the Sarah Keyes complaint? Do they see the writing on the wall with Brown v. Board?
Not initially. The initial ICC reviewing commissioner assigned to the case declined to accept it. The commissioner made a highly compartmentalized legal argument. He stated that the Brown decision only applied to public institutions like state-funded schools and did not preclude segregation in a private business such as a bus company.
So the bureaucracy's instinct is to build a wall around their jurisdiction. Yes, the schools must integrate, but we govern private commerce and private businesses can do what they want.
But Dovey Johnson Roundtree refused to accept that dismissal. She understood the massive implications of the Commerce Clause. She aggressively petitioned for a full on-bank review by the entire 11-person commission to the ICC. She argued that the logic of Brown that separate is inherently unequal must apply to interstate travel.
And against all odds, she wins the room.
She wins a decisive victory.
Yeah.
On November 7, 1955, in the case of Sarah Keyes v. Carolina Coach Company, the full ICC explicitly and formally banned bus segregation in interstate travel.
Incredible.
This was a monumental ruling. It officially extended the moral and legal logic of Brown v. Board of Education out of the classroom and injected it directly into the realm of private businesses operating across state lines.
I really want you listening to this to consider what this means in the broader context of history. The battle for civil rights wasn't just fought in the streets or at lunch counters or in the high-profile Supreme Court chambers. It was fought in the dusty filing cabinets and obscure administrative hearing rooms of a railroad regulatory agency.
Yeah.
It's like discovering a loophole in the IRS tax code and using it to achieve a massive human rights victory. It's finding the lever of power wherever it is hidden and pulling it with everything you have.
It was incredibly strategic, and it paved the way for further action. In 1960, the Supreme Court ruled in Boynton v. Virginia that segregation in the actual bus terminal buildings was also illegal under the Interstate Commerce Act.
And finally,
on September 23, 1961, at the heavy, direct insistence of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who was dealing with the violence surrounding the Freedom Riders, the ICC issued sweeping, definitive new rules.
They finally put some teeth into it.
Yes. They mandated that all interstate buses display a physical certificate stating that seating is without regard to race, color, creed, or national origin. And it had to explicitly say it was by order of the Interstate Commerce Commission.
It is an incredible, undeniable legacy. The ICC was a vital instrument in dismantling Jim Crow in transportation. But historical narratives are rarely simple. Even as the ICC was making these landmark rulings on human dignity, the actual economic foundation of the agency, the core reason it was created to protect consumers back in 1887, was rotting from the inside out.
It was.
The economists were starting to look hard at the data, and they realized the ICC had become deeply structurally corrupted.
The civil rights victories were a triumph of using the regulatory machinery for good, but the economic machinery itself was fundamentally broken. Which brings us to a crucial concept in public policy: the era of the cartel, the rise of the critics, and the theory of regulatory capture.
This is where the economists enter the narrative, and they are absolutely ruthless in their assessment of the ICC. We need to talk about Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate, and his son, David D. Friedman. What did they see happening under the hood of this agency?
Let's start with Milton Friedman's analysis. He looked at the long arc of the ICC and identified it as the textbook, classic case of regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture.
Right. It's an economic theory that describes a deeply cynical cycle. A regulatory agency is created by public demand to act in the public interest, to protect the people from a powerful industry. But over time, the agency gets co-opted or captured by the very industry it is supposed to be regulating.
How does that actually happen? How does the watchdog become the guard dog for the burglar?
It happens through a slow alignment of interests. The general public, the farmers who protested in the 1880s, eventually go back to their lives. They aren't paying daily attention to the ICC. But the railroad executives, their entire profit margin depends on what the ICC does.
So they dedicate all their resources to it.
Exactly. So the railroads hire the best lawyers, the best lobbyists, and they engage with the ICC every single day. Eventually, a revolving door develops. The people working at the ICC come from the railroad industry, and when they leave the ICC, they go back to the railroad industry.
So the culture merges.
Precisely. Friedman argued that the existing railroad interests quickly realized it was much cheaper and far more profitable to control the ICC than to try and compete in a ruthless free market.
Oh, that makes sense.
They used the ICC's regulations, the very rules designed to stop them, to erect massive barriers to entry, strengthen their monopolistic control, and legally prevent new competition from emerging.
Let's use an analogy to clarify this mechanism. It's like a town that builds a massive dam to protect a village from a flooding river. The dam is run by a government agency.
Okay.
But over time, the private water company buys off the dam operators. And soon, the operators aren't using the dam to stop floods. They are using the dam to artificially restrict the water supply, causing a drought in competing villages so the private water company can charge a premium for bottled water.
The tool of protection becomes a weapon of monopoly.
That is exactly the mechanism, and David D. Friedman explicitly expanded on this by looking at how the ICC handled emerging technologies. He argued that the ICC essentially served as a government-enforced cartelizing agent for the railroads.
The cartelizing agent,
Yeah.
meaning they forced everyone to collude on high prices. How did they do that with the trucking industry? Remember back in 1935, the ICC expanded its buffet of power by taking over interstate trucking and bus lines.
According to the critics, we have to look at why they took over trucking. They didn't do it to protect the consumer from bad truck drivers. They did it to protect the railroads from the trucks.
In the 1930s, trucks were new, they were nimble, they didn't have massive infrastructure costs like maintaining steel rails, and they were aggressively undercutting the railroads on freight prices. The railroads were terrified.
So the railroads go to their captured agency, the ICC, and ask for help.
Yes. And the ICC's response was to use its authority to force the trucking companies to raise their rates. They actively denied licenses to new trucking companies who wanted to offer cheaper routes.
That is insane.
They artificially inflated the cost of shipping by truck, specifically to prevent them from undercutting the railroad's outdated business model.
Wait, I want to make sure the listener grasps the absurdity of this. If I'm a farmer or a manufacturer in 1940 and I want to ship my goods by truck because the truck is faster and significantly cheaper, the federal government steps in and says, no, that is illegal. The truck driver must charge you more money so that you are forced to consider using the more expensive, slower train so that the railroad company doesn't go bankrupt.
You have grasped it perfectly. They were deliberately propping up an obsolete technology by punishing the innovative one. And the American consumer paid the price in hidden inflation on every single shipped good. The illusion of regulation is highly profitable for the regulated.
Okay, my mind is completely blown because this takes us all the way back to Richard Olney in 1892, the letter we discussed earlier. Olney told the president of the railroad that the commission satisfies the popular clamor while being of great use to the railroads. He wasn't just being cynical. He was engineering the capture from day one. He predicted the Milton Friedman thesis over 80 years before Friedman published it.
only saw the architectural flaw from the beginning, and by the 1970s, the economic damage caused by this cartel behavior became mathematically impossible to ignore. The criticism of the ICC was mounting to a fever pitch, and uniquely, it was coming from all sides of the political spectrum.
That is rare. Usually agencies have partisan defenders.
Not the ICC in the 70s. You had critics on the political left, including consumer advocates like Ralph Nader, who saw the ICC as a bloated, inefficient, corporate captured bureaucracy that was stifling progress and hurting the working class.
And on the right.
And you had critics on the political right, the free market economists, who saw it as a massive, unnatural interference in capitalism that was destroying market efficiencies.
When both the progressive left and the free market right look at your agency and agree that it is an unmitigated disaster, your days are severely numbered. Which brings us to the final chapter, the slow dismantling and the eventual abolition of the ICC. But you can't just flip a switch and turn off a 100-year-old bureaucracy. How does it actually die?
It dies through a slow process of legislative amputation. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. As we mentioned, Congress actually started stripping away peripheral powers quite early.
Right, like the telecom stuff.
Exactly. In 1934, they realized regulating telegraphs and trains together was absurd, so they took telecommunications away and gave it to the newly created Federal Communications Commission. Then, in 1970, jurisdiction over rail safety, the crash investigations, and equipment standards was transferred to the Federal Railroad Administration under the newer Department of Transportation.
So they are slowly losing limbs. But the real death blow, the strike to the heart of their economic power, comes with the massive deregulation wave of the 1970s and 1980s. What changed in the political calculus?
The physical reality of the American transportation network was collapsing. Despite all the ICC's protectionist cartel behavior, the railroads were going bankrupt anyway. Companies like Penn Central filed for historic bankruptcies.
So the protection didn't even work.
No. The tracks were literally falling apart because the regulations were so stifling, so slow, and so rigid that the railroads couldn't adapt to the modern logistics market. They couldn't secure capital to rebuild.
The micromanagement finally choked the patient to death. So Congress has to step in and apply a defibrillator. They start torching the 1887 rulebook.
Precisely. We see a series of massive, sweeping deregulation bills. It starts with the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 1976, known as the 4R Act, which began loosening rate controls.
Okay.
But the fatal double punch lands in 1980. First, the Motor Carrier Act of 1980 massively deregulates the trucking industry, allowing new companies to enter the market and compete on price. Then, later that year, the Staggers Rail Act of 1980 essentially strips the ICC of its day-to-day control over the railroads.
Let's explain what the Staggers Act actually did on the ground. Before 1980, if a railroad wanted to lower a price to win a shipping contract, or if they wanted to start running trains on a rural route that was losing money, what did they have to do?
Before Staggers, they had to file an application with the ICC, endure months or sometimes years of public hearings, face protests from competitors, and beg for permission. It paralyzed business decisions.
And after Staggers?
After the Staggers Act, railroads were suddenly allowed to negotiate confidential, dynamic pricing contracts directly with shippers based on market demand. They were allowed to quickly abandon highly unprofitable rural branch lines.
And what was the result? Did the sky fall like the Grange movement predicted a century earlier?
The opposite happened. Politicians like Senator Fred R. Harris of Oklahoma had strongly advocated for abolishing the commission, arguing the free market would save the industry, and they were right.
Really?
The railroad industry experienced a massive, unprecedented renaissance. Without the ICC micromanaging their balance sheets, railroads became profitable again. They reinvested billions into track maintenance and new locomotives. Freight rates, adjusted for inflation, actually plummeted for consumers because efficiency skyrocketed.
The cure to the crisis was simply removing the agency that was ostensibly managing it. By the 1990s, the Staggers Act had proven so successful that the ICC was left as a hollowed-out ghost of its former self. It had almost no real economic power left to wield. So what was the final nail in the coffin?
The end came in December 1995. Congress passed the ICC Termination Act. After 108 years of continuous operation, the agency was finally officially abolished. The final chair, a woman named Gail McDonald, oversaw the administrative process of shutting off the lights and locking the doors.
It's kind of sad in a weird way.
It is. But like any complex bureaucracy, the ICC didn't completely evaporate into thin air. It was more of an organ donation.
Right, because even in a deregulated market, you still need some foundational oversight. You can't have complete anarchy regarding corporate mergers or safety data.
Exactly. The government still needed a referee, just not a dictator. So the ICC's few remaining vital functions, like reviewing major corporate mergers to prevent absolute monopolies or finalizing the legal abandonment of railroad lines, were transferred to a brand new, significantly smaller, and much weaker agency called the Surface Transportation Board, or STB.
And what happened to the trucking oversight?
The licensing and safety registration of motor carriers was transferred to the Federal Highway Administration. Eventually, that function was spun off into the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the FMCSA.
And this administrative organ donation leads to a detail that I absolutely love, because I guarantee that you, the listener, have seen this, but perhaps never understood what you were looking at.
Oh, the trucks.
Yes. If you are ever driving down the interstate today and you pass an 18-wheeler, I want you to look at the side door of the cab. You will see a number printed there that says USDOT followed by a string of digits. That USDOT number is the direct, visible ghost of the ICC.
That is a brilliant connection to make. Before the ICC was abolished, they issued specific identification numbers to every trucking company they licensed, which were printed as ICCMC, followed by the carrier's numbers.
And then they just swapped it out.
When the ICC was terminated in 1995 and the Department of Transportation took over, USDOT numbers simply replaced the old ICCMC numbers.
So every piece of freight moving on the highway today carries the genetic marker of an 1887 railroad law. Those numbers are critical infrastructure. They allow the government to track carrier identification, audit safety records, and coordinate complex logistics across state lines. The infrastructure of commerce still requires oversight. It just operates under a different, somewhat more rational name now.
The agency died, but its administrative DNA permanently infected the entire structure of the federal government. Which brings us to the ultimate, lasting legacy of the Interstate Commerce Commission.
When historians look back at this 108-year experiment, what is the final verdict?
The legacy is that the ICC was the definitive blueprint for the modern administrative state. It proved to Congress that you could create a full-time, permanent regulatory body made up of appointed experts who, theoretically, had no partisan political ties to the industries they regulated.
Right. They weren't elected politicians subject to the whims of the ballot box. They were career administrators.
And once Congress saw the blueprint, they copied it relentlessly.
Relentlessly.
They used the ICC model to create the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, the Federal Communications Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934, the National Labor Relations Board in 1935, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission in 1975.
It's everywhere.
All of these powerful entities were modeled directly on the ICC's structure of a multi-headed independent commission with staggered terms. Its influence even crossed the globe. If you look at the Constitution of Australia, it actually provides for an interstate commission that was explicitly directly modeled after the American ICC.
It is the template for modern governance. But the source material notes something really profound about that blueprint today, and I want to leave you, the listener, with this final thought to mull over. In recent decades, the United States government has essentially stopped creating independent commissions like the ICC. The multi-headed independent model has gone completely out of fashion in Washington.
Yes. If you look at the major regulatory agencies created since the 1970s, agencies with massive power over your daily life, like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, or the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, they aren't run by a bipartisan panel of 5 independent commissioners serving staggered terms.
No, they're not.
They are usually headed by a single person, an administrator, who is directly appointed by and answers directly to the President of the United States. They are structured as executive divisions, not independent branches.
And I want you to really think about what that structural shift means for the country. We missed away from regulatory bodies that were intentionally designed to be isolated from the shifting winds of presidential elections bodies that were meant to be cold, calculated, and somewhat immune to public pressure. We have replaced them with agencies that are directly tied to the whims of the Oval Office, where the enforcement of safety rules or environmental standards can change drastically the moment a new president is inaugurated.
It is the central, unresolved tension of the modern administrative state. Which system is actually better?
Exactly. As you navigate the countless rules that govern your life today, the safety standards at your workplace, the environmental regulations on your car, the security lines at the airport, ask yourself, is it better for a powerful regulator to be completely independent, operating like an untouchable panel of experts? Or is it better for them to be completely accountable to the politicians we elect, subject to the messy, volatile realities of a democracy? There is no easy answer. But the ghost of the ICC, that very first clunky, over-engineered, massively flawed gear in the machinery of government, is watching us as we continually try to figure it out. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the hidden structures around you, keep looking for the history in the everyday, and we will see you next time.